Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In today's video, we are talking about the Detroit Pistons and previewing the upcoming 2020-2021 season for Detroit. But before I get too far into it, I want to remind you all to leave a like and subscribe. I've been appreciating all the support that I've been receiving lately, and I hope to see that continue. Without further ado, let's talk about the Pistons. But before we can preview the season, I want to talk about what they did in the offseason. It started with some interesting trades. They flipped Bruce Brown for Zanin Moza and a second-round pick. It was a move that made sense for both sides, as the Nets acquired someone that can give them some bench minutes at the guard positions, and the Pistons got a player with a bit more long-term potential, as well as a second-round pick. So for both teams' agendas, this was a flip-flop that made some sense. Next, they gave up Trevor Ariza and a well-protected first-round pick that is pretty much protected all the way through like 2025, and even if it does convey in 2025, I believe it's a top 9 protected pick, and if it doesn't convey by then, it'll convert into being 2 second-round picks. So basically, the Pistons acquired a current first-round pick in exchange for a pick that might not even ever convey as a first-round pick. And they also brought in Trevor Ariza, who they would flip to acquire DeLon Wright, who can give them some good minutes either as a stopgap starter filler at the point guard or shooting guard position, or just as a good guy who can give you really competent minutes off of the bench. So overall, I think that was certainly a win for the Pistons. Then came draft night. With the 7th pick, they took Killian Hayes, which was a pick that I actually liked quite a bit for them. On my personal team big board that I made for the Pistons, he was the number 1 guy. So I think that was a pretty nice grab for the team. Or he was the number 1 guy remaining after LaMelo Ball and James Wiseman were off the board. But out of the options they had, I think they made the right choice. At 16, they went with Isaiah Stewart. At that pick, I really thought that they should have gone with Saddiq Bey, and I think that he would have been the right choice, but he ended up falling to them at the 19th pick, which they acquired through another trade where they gave up Luke Kennard as well as 4 second-round picks to get that 19th pick, which they would use to select Saddiq Bey. In my opinion, the Bey pick wasn't perfect. I would have taken him at 16, so getting him at 19 was amazing, and I shouldn't have said that pick wasn't perfect, because I think it was a perfect grab for them, and they got great value out of getting him at 19. I had him 14th on my personal big board. I think Isaiah Stewart might have been a bit of a reach at 16, but if you flip-flop these two and say that Saddiq Bey went 16th and Isaiah Stewart went 19th, then this draft looks pretty good for the Pistons. So overall, I think they did a nice job drafting there. They would acquire another pick by giving up cash considerations as well as a trade exception in exchange for Tony Bradley, a young center from the Jazz, as well as the 38th overall pick, which they would use to select, what's his name again? Saben Lee from Vanderbilt. I thought that was a bit of a reach, as I did not have him as one of my 46 players that I believe should have gotten a guaranteed contract, but he actually didn't get a guaranteed contract. They got him to take a two-way, which was a bit surprising for someone that went as early as 38th overall, but he does have some potential, so I can't hate on the pick too much. After that, following the draft, they would trade Tony Bradley for Zaire Smith, who they have now announced that they will be using the stretch provision on and will not be a part of their team. And they also traded Tony Snell and Kyrie Thomas in exchange for Dwayne Dedmon, who they have also used the stretch provision on. So basically, they traded for those 2 guys and immediately released them in order to free up cap space. And they used that cap space to make some interesting signings. The first one that came along was Mason Plumlee on a 3-year, $25 million deal. I do think that this overvalues Plumlee quite a bit, but he does fit what this team is looking to do by bringing in veterans that are known to work hard, known to have a good motor, and Plumlee does fit that bill. They also paid Jeremy Grant 3 years, a 3-year deal worth $60 million. Another overpay, but another guy that's going to be a nice fit in their locker room. They must have said something to get him to agree with what they're trying to do, because he got the same offer from the Denver Nuggets, who are likely to be a championship contender this season, and he decided that he would rather be a Piston than a Nugget. So they must have sold Jeremy Grant. He's excited to step in and have a higher offensive role, but I'm not sure that that's the best fit for him. More on Jeremy Grant a bit later. Next, they signed Jahlil Okafor to a 2-year deal for the minimum. Not much to see here. Minimum contract filling out the roster, but at the time people were giving the Pistons a really tough time because they had then traded for Dwayne Dedmon, signed Mason Plumlee, and drafted Isaiah Stewart recently. So then adding a fourth center to that big man rotation did not seem like the best idea. But in retrospect, after they waived Dwayne Dedmon, Okafor is pretty much their third center who is on a minimum deal. So I don't think that that is too big of a deal, and certainly not the deal that people were making it to be, considering how low his pay actually will be. They also brought in Wayne Ellington on another deal I believe was very close to the minimum. Not much to see here, another player to just fill out end of the bench depth. And finally, they signed Josh Jackson. This is probably my favorite signing that the Pistons made because he's a young player that is very interesting. So overall, out of all these signings, I would say that Josh Jackson was the best one. But that might just indicate that none of them were too great. But I do see what their general manager, Troy Weaver, is trying to work towards. He's not trying to make them the process 76ers that just got run over every single night. He wants to surround his young talent with some veterans that can allow them to be competitive and not be the worst team in the NBA. He's also taking advantage a little bit of the new draft lottery rules that make it a much more high chance that you can move up in the draft if you have the 7th or 8th or 9th odds, as we've seen teams like New Orleans and Memphis and Charlotte and Chicago do over the past couple of years. That's what Troy Weaver is betting on, and if it works out for him, then these signings could look a lot better in the long run. He has a plan. Now it just remains to be seen whether or not that plan is the right way of going about this rebuild. In addition to wanting to be competitive, he also targeted young players that are known to have a good motor and work hard in the draft. So he's really just trying to bring the right culture to Detroit, and I think that that has to be applauded. Looking to be a competent NBA team is not something that lots of these young rebuilding teams do. So I do give him some credit for that, and with the success we saw teams like the Miami Heat and the Denver Nuggets that have established that excellent culture had in the playoffs last year, I do think that culture is an undervalued asset for NBA teams, and the Pistons are certainly looking to take advantage of that culture boost. The next part of this season preview, I will go over every player on the roster and give my thoughts and expectations for what they can do in this upcoming season. We'll start at the point guard position, as always, and at that spot, I think the most likely starter will be Killian Hayes, who they drafted 7th overall out of Ulm in France. He played in the EuroLeague last year and was considered a top 10 prospect by almost everyone. I had him 8th or 9th on my board, my personal board, and I think that there's a chance that he works out and becomes a really good lead guard. I would say that a ceiling for him would be D'Angelo Russell, reaching a point where he has excellent ball handling skills and can really shoot the 3 ball. I don't love the D'Lo comparison actually though, because I do think that Killian is probably already a better defender than D'Lo. But if he can improve on that jump shot and improve on his ball handling and get it to the level that D'Lo is at right now, and even coming out of Ohio State, D'Angelo Russell was one of the better ball handlers that we had seen in the draft. So if Killian can escalate those two aspects of his game, it will make him probably a top 10 or 15 point guard in the NBA. I don't think that his ceiling is much higher than that, though, because he doesn't have the elite burst type stuff that you really need in order to be an effective slasher at the NBA level. I think that he will be limited to being a pick and roll maestro who can run the pick and roll as the guard player, make the right decision, whether it's a kick out to his teammate, whether it's attempting a mid-range shot, or finding the roller, running to the rim for a lob. I trust him to do that, but I don't think that he'll be able to create shots for himself off of isolations. I think that he's going to be much more reliant on the pick and roll type stuff. But like I said, I do think that he's going to be at least a league average defender because he is a strong kid with a good sized body. So overall, I think the Pistons got a nice player for them to sort of build around and has a chance to end up being a really nice piece for this upcoming rebuild. The backup point guard position is going to be held down by probably Derrick Rose. I do think there's a chance that Rose could start, but Dwayne Casey seemed very hesitant to insert D Rose into the starting lineup. He only started 30% of the games he played in last season, and considering that Bruce Brown was the starter for a couple of those games, I don't think that Dwayne Casey is going to be rushing to start D Rose. If Rose isn't starting the game, it allows Casey to have a better control over how many minutes he plays, which is important as Rose continues to age and has injury concerns. So I think it's likely that he will be coming off the bench once again. But as a bench player, he is going to be in the running for Sixth Man of the Year because he's one of the better finishers from the guard position in the entire NBA. He's still a very good playmaker for his teammates. He's not a terrible guy in terms of taking care of the ball. He turns it over a bit more than you would like him to, but with the amount of time he spends with the ball in his hands, that's going to happen. The questions come with the shooting, where he's been on and off. I think he had a season where he actually did shoot it in the high 30s, maybe 37-ish percent. But last year he was back down to 30%, and I think that's more what real expectation could be for him this season. He's also not a good defensive player where he's clearly a negative, but you're not asking for much more than that from Derrick Rose. He's going to come off the bench and score for you, and that's about it. Moving on to DeLon Wright, who is another guy who can play both the 1 and the 2. I think that he'll be competing to start at the shooting guard position. It'll be between him and Svi Mikhailuk. Maybe Josh Jackson can get his name into the running there, although I do view him as more of a 3 than a 2. But DeLon is a good defender at the point of attack. I think that he is going to line up very well alongside Killian Hayes because Killian is such a big kid that he's going to be able to take on bigger perimeter players on the defensive end of the floor, while DeLon can really pester point guards. He's good at forcing turnovers, had a high steal percentage last year with Dallas, and overall is just a good, impactful defensive player. On offense, he can space the floor. He shot 37% from 3 last year, which is certainly a competent mark, and he's a good role player to have. He played under Dwayne Casey in Toronto, so I do think that there's a chance that he could receive a bit of a coach's favorite type treatment here, and we could see him start perhaps over Killian Hayes at the point guard spot, but more likely at the shooting guard spot over Svi Mikhailuk. But DeLon Wright was a good guy for them to get because of his three-point shooting and defensive ability. Moving on to the more wing-type guys, it starts with Svi Mikhailuk here. He's an elite shooter, elite floor spacer, shot the ball over 40% from 3 last year. The questions are if he can do much else besides that. He's not much of a shot creator for his teammates at this point, and on defense, he's a net negative as well. If he can improve on his shot creation abilities and improve on his defense, then that's where he can start growing into a bigger role. At this point, though, it remains to be seen if he can do that, but at the very least, he's an elite floor spacer, and that is certainly valuable to an NBA team, and for that reason, I do think that there's a chance that he will be the starting 2 guard for the Detroit Pistons when the season kicks off on December 22nd. Wayne Ellington and Rodney McGruder are 2 guys that this team brought on for the minimum. They have different roles that they can play as bench guys who can give you a couple minutes. Ellington is a good shooter. We saw him have a great three-point shooting season actually with the Miami Heat, where he was super effective shooting threes off of movement. However, he had a pretty bad season last year with the New York Knicks. Only shot at 35% from three, and really is not much of a finisher whatsoever. He also had one of his worst defensive seasons of his career last year with New York. But if he can improve the three-point shooting and get back to the levels that he's been at as a league average defensive player, then Wayne Ellington can be a reliable player to come off the bench and give Detroit some solid minutes. Rodney McGruder is a bit more of a defensive specialist. He's really not much of a three-point shooter whatsoever. He's not great at finishing at the rim, and even once he does get inside, all you have to do is foul him because he's a pretty poor free throw shooter. Overall, he has an absolute nothing on the offensive end of the floor. But he is a pretty good defender. He's done a good job in team rotations. We saw him play a couple minutes for the LA Clippers last year. I don't remember if it was in the playoffs or just in the seeding games, but he was in the bubble and he did play a bit of a role on a championship contender. The Pistons decided to waive Zaire Smith and stretch his contract instead of Rodney McGruder's. So clearly they must value him a little bit. So he's going to be a guy that they probably look to keep around and use as a defensive stopper off the bench. Jeremy Grant is another wing player. He could kind of be considered a big, but I would certainly consider him to be more of a wing. I think that this was one of the bigger overpays of the offseason, both because Jeremy Grant is a poor fit in Detroit and because I don't think that he is that good of a player overall. We saw him be an absolute negative on the Denver Nuggets last year. I believe they were around 8 points better with him off the court than they were with him on it, which is always a poor indicator. 8 points per 100 possessions, that is, excuse me. So that really makes me question the actual value of Jeremy Grant. He did shoot it very well last year, 39% from three, but 100% of his made threes last year. That's right, 100% of his threes were off of assists. Now, he didn't take a single one that wasn't assisted. He can't create open looks for himself. All of it had to come off of the stars, Nikola Jokic and Jamal Murray. Once he doesn't have those two guys creating open looks for him anymore, I question whether or not Jeremy Grant will still be able to space the floor at the same level he did before. He also is not much of a shot creator for his teammates, and he has said that he wants to have a higher offensive role in the Detroit Pistons system, but I just don't know if he's ready to take on that type of role. However, this guy is known as a super hard worker, a super high character guy, and he is going to work hard. Right now, I have a lot of questions about this contract and think it was a bad move, but I do think that there is a chance that Jeremy Grant and the Detroit Pistons prove me completely wrong. Grant comes out and plays up to his contract, and if that does happen, then I guess I'll be forced to, what's the saying? Eat crow and admit that I was wrong. Saddiq Bey is another interesting wing guy that the Pistons brought in the draft this past offseason. Bey was the 14th guy on my board, as I mentioned before, so grabbing him at 19 was a really nice value pick. I think that he's going to be a nice 3-and-D guy, and he also can do a bit more than that because he is a really good passer, and he's going to be able to run some pick and roll in my belief. So I think that was a really nice pick. I would not be shocked whatsoever if Saddiq Bey ends up exceeding Killian Hayes in this upcoming season and people being like, hey, how did this guy fall all the way to 19? I think that he's going to be an elite role player almost right off the bat. So nice pick by the Pistons there. And I think that Saddiq Bey could be a bit of a sleeper for an all-rookie team in this upcoming season. It depends on how many minutes he can get. I probably would have made the case for him to be a competitor for all-rookie first team if not for the Jeremy Grant signing. Moving on to Josh Jackson, another new guy to this team, as we saw Troy Weaver pretty much tear the team down and rebuild it in his image and rebuild it the way that he believed that NBA teams should be built. Jackson is a versatile wing defender who can guard multiple positions, is actually very active on defense, averaged 2 steals and 2 blocks per 100 possessions last year, and that is always a good indicator of a defensive playmaker. The questions come on offense, but we did see him have an uptick in his three-point shooting last season. He was more willing to take them. A much higher percentage of his shot chart came from behind the three-point line. That needs to continue in order for Josh Jackson to be worthwhile as an NBA player. But we did actually see him shoot the ball pretty well at Kansas. I think he shot at 37% in his 1 year there from the three-point line, and he's only shot at 31 or 32% in his for his career so far. So if he can get that three-point shooting back to where it was in college while continuing to increase the volume of three-point shots he takes, then I think Josh Jackson has a chance to establish himself as a starter-level player. Not the guy the Suns were envisioning when they took him 4th overall in the 2017 NBA draft, but I do still think that there's potential here, especially if he can figure out the character stuff that plagued him during his time in Phoenix. Moving on to Zanin Moza. I apologize if I'm not saying that name correctly. But Moza is a somewhat interesting young piece that the Pistons added to their core. At the moment, he was one of the worst players in the NBA last season. He really needs to improve his offensive decision-making as he posted a high turnover rate. Really has no shot creation ability whatsoever, cannot play make for his teammates, and takes very questionable shots from the three-point line where he's a pretty poor shooter. So you might question why the Pistons would have any interest in bringing Moza on in exchange for a player that had established himself as a rotation piece in Bruce Brown. But I would answer that question by replying that he's a 6'9" wing that has maybe some shooting potential, and those type of guys are always valued by NBA teams. So, yeah, I don't think I'm much of a Moza fan at all, but maybe if he can figure it out, then this will end up being a worthwhile endeavor for the Pistons. Blake Griffin is a former All-Star who has really fallen from grace at this point due to injuries and old age. His athleticism that was once so elite has really fallen. That's made him a bit of a liability on the defensive end of the floor, where despite being so athletic, he was never particularly good. And on offense, he doesn't have the same burst that allows him to be the elite scorer he once was. I get that he's improved skill-wise and he's gotten to be a better three-point shooter, but he's not good enough at that type of stuff to cancel out for the loss of his athleticism. So clearly Blake Griffin is on the downward slope of his career. But if he can come out this season, prove that he's capable of playing 25 to 28 minutes per game, and be a fraction of his best self, then I still think that he could reinvigorate some trade value that could see the Pistons deal him in exchange for at least something of value at some point. It's going to be hard because he has such a high contract, and as we've learned in the past couple of seasons, it's really hard to match those type of deals. But if a team is desperate enough, Blake Griffin should be a very tradable guy, and he, along with Derrick Rose, are the two veterans on this team that they should look to move on from to bring on some future draft capital. Sekou Doumbouya was the first-round pick of the Pistons in the 2019 NBA draft. He had a few flashes of excitement during his rookie season, but overall, he really struggled. He was one of the youngest, if not the youngest player in the entire NBA, and it certainly showed. He kind of had a hard time on the defensive end, was not quite able to grasp NBA defensive rotations, and couldn't make plays defensively the way he did in the EuroLeague prior to being drafted. And on offense, he struggled to shoot the ball and did not finish at the rim at a high level either. So on offense, he was a real net negative. So overall, you didn't get too much from Sekou Doumbouya in his rookie season outside of some flashes. I think that he still has a potential, though, to develop into a good NBA player. He's still super young. I think he's like the same age, if not younger, than this year's first-round pick, Killian Hayes. So if Sekou can reach that potential that the Pistons once saw in him when they took him right outside the lottery with the 15th pick, and I do think that he can, then he'll certainly factor into this team's plans moving forward. And I'm sure he does anyways, as someone they are very much invested in as a first-round pick just 1 year ago. Finally, at the center position, we have Mason Plumlee, who is not a great player, but he certainly can function as a stopgap center. And once Isaiah Stewart is ready to play the starting center position, then I think that Plumlee will be one of the better backup centers in the NBA. He's a pretty good rebounder because he's a good athlete for his size, and on the offensive end, he's a good pick and roll big man who is very good at making passes out of the short roll. He's also a decent rim runner and can finish lobs at a pretty solid rate due to that athleticism that I talked about before. On defense, he's a decent rim protector. I think he averaged 3.7 blocks per 100 possessions, so that is certainly a valuable trait. This Plumlee signing has gotten a lot of flack, but overall, it's not as significant as some of the other overpays we saw teams make in this past offseason, and I think that there's potential that this deal could be all right for the Pistons at some point. I'm not sure that I would have preferred to spend this money on Mason Plumlee than I would have on Christian Wood, but the Pistons have what they have now, and they have to make the best that they can out of it. Isaiah Stewart, as their second big guy, is interesting to me because he's known as a really high character kid. Everybody likes Isaiah, and if he can use that and use his hard work ethic to develop his offensive game as well as his defensive abilities as a pick and roll defender where he does need to improve, that's where someday I can see him being a starting center in the league. He's a high energy guy who can finish in the paint offensively, and if he can develop a jump shot, we could see him be a valuable offensive center. I think he'll be a starter at some point, but it remains to be seen how impactful he can actually be on a winning basketball team. Finally, Jahlil Okafor, the definition of a dinosaur in the game of basketball, as a guy who can finish at the rim and can kind of block shots and protect the rim on the other end, but I mean, overall, he would have been a much better player in the early 2000s or even the 1990s, but at this point, his game is just out of style. He can't really guard whatsoever on the perimeter, and he's not an elite shot blocker by any stretch either. So, other than the inside scoring, you're not getting much with Okafor, and I think there were better options that the Pistons could have signed on the minimum than Jahlil. I think I've covered everyone now. Oh, Saben Lee, the two-way player. Super athletic, is pretty gifted at getting around people, has a quick first step that allows him to get into the paint and create some offense for his teammates. That's where he needs to improve, though. He's a pretty good finisher, but he's not much of a playmaker. He can use that athleticism to get to the rim and finish, but he can't use it to create looks. He has to improve in that passing ability, and he also has to improve his jump shot, as he was a pretty bad shooter throughout his career at Vanderbilt. I believe he was around 32% from three, but if he can get that up into the mid-30s, then I do think that there's a chance that because of his explosiveness, he could be a backup point guard guy at some point in his basketball career. I think that's everything. If I were to make a prediction about this Pistons team for the upcoming season, I would say that they will probably win anywhere from, well, it's a shortened season. I think in a regular season they would probably be like a 24 to 28 win team, but because it's a shortened season, I will say that the Pistons will win somewhere between 20 and 25 games this season. Let me know what you think the Pistons record will be in the comment section down below. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Like I said, there's going to be a lot more basketball content on this channel for you to enjoy. So if you like hearing people talk about the NBA, this is the place for you. I think that's going to be it for me. Ladies and gentlemen, I will see you all again very soon.